Thank you for joining us this evening for the 7th chapter of Lemuel Gulliver's Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World by Jonathan Swift. The 7th chapter in which the author, being informed of a design to accuse him of high treason, makes his escape to Blefuscu and his reception there. Before I proceed to give an account of my leaving this kingdom, it may be proper to inform the reader of a private intrigue which had been for 2 months forming against me. I had been hitherto all my life a stranger to courts, for which I was unqualified by the meanness of my condition. Well, I had indeed heard and read enough of the disposition of the great princes and ministers, but never expected to have found such terrible effects of them in so remote a country, governed, as I thought, by very different maxims from those in Europe. When I was just preparing to pay my attendance on the Emperor of Blefuscu, a considerable person at court, to whom I had been very serviceable at a time when he lay under the highest displeasure of his imperial majesty, came to my house, very privately at night, in a closed chair, and without sending his name, desired admittance. The chairmen were dismissed. I put the chair, with his lordship in it, into my coat pocket, and, giving orders to a trusty servant to say that I was indisposed and gone to sleep, I fastened the door of my house, placed the chair on the table, according to my usual custom, and sat down by it. After the common salutations were over, observing his lordship's countenance full of concern, and inquiring into the reason, he desired I would hear him with patience in a matter that highly concerned my honor and my life. His speech was to the following effect, for I took notes of it as soon as he left me. You are to know, said he, that several committees of council have been lately called in the most private manner on your account, and it is but 2 days since His Majesty came to a full resolution. Now, you are very sensible that Skyrish Bolgolam, Galbat, or High Admiral, has been your mortal enemy almost ever since your arrival. Now, his original reasons I know not, but his hatred is increased since your great success against Blefuscu, by which his glory as admiral is much diminished, obscured. This lord, in conjunction with Flimnap the High Treasurer, whose enmity against you is notorious on account of his lady, and Limtok the General, Laulcon the Chamberlain, and Balmoth the Grand Justiciary, have prepared articles of impeachment against you for treason and other capital crimes. Now, this preface made me so impatient, being conscious of my own merits and innocence, that I was going to interrupt him, when he entreated me to be silent, and thus proceeded. Out of gratitude for the favors you have done me, I procured information of the whole proceedings, and a copy of the articles, wherein I venture my head for your service. Articles of impeachment against Quinbus Flestrin, the Man Mountain. Article 1. Whereas, by a statute made in the reign of His Imperial Majesty Caelan Defar Plune, it is enacted that whoever shall make water within the precincts of the royal palace shall be liable to the pains and penalties of high treason, notwithstanding the said Quinbus Flestrin, in open breach of the said law, under colour of extinguishing the fire kindled in the apartment of His Majesty's most dear imperial consort, did maliciously, traitorously, and devilishly, by discharge of his urine, put out the said fire kindled in the said apartment, lying and being within the precincts of the said royal palace, against the statute in that case provided, etc., against the duty, etc. Article 2. That the said Quinbus Flestrin, having brought the imperial fleet of Blefuscu to the royal port, and being afterwards commanded by His Imperial Majesty to seize all the other ships of the said Empire of Blefuscu, and to reduce that empire to a province, to be governed by a viceroy from hence, and to destroy and put to death not only all the big Indian exiles, but likewise all the people of that empire who would not immediately forsake the big Indian heresy. He, the said Flestrin, like a false traitor against his most auspicious serene imperial majesty, did petition to be excused from the said service upon pretense of unwillingness to force the consciences or destroy the liberties and lives of an innocent people. Article 3. That, whereas certain ambassadors arrived from the court of Blefuscu to sue for peace in his majesty's court, he, the said Flestrin, did, like a false traitor, aid, abet, comfort, and divert the said ambassadors, although he knew them to be servants to a prince who was lately an open enemy to his imperial majesty and in open war against his said majesty. Article 4. That the said Quinbus Flestrin, contrary to the duty of a faithful subject, is now preparing to make a voyage to the court and empire of Blefuscu, for which he has received only the verbal license from his imperial majesty, and under colour of the said license does falsely and traitorously intend to take said voyage, and thereby to aid, comfort, and abet the emperor of Blefuscu, so lately an enemy, and in open war with his imperial majesty aforesaid. There are some other articles, but these are the most important, of which I have read you an abstract. In the several debates upon this impeachment, it must be confessed that his majesty gave many marks of his great lenity, often urging the services that you had done him, and endeavouring to extenuate your crimes. The treasurer and admiral insisted that you should be put to the most painful and ignominious death, by setting fire to your house at night, and the general was to attend with 20,000 men armed with poisoned arrows to shoot you on the face and hands. Some of your servants were to have private orders to strew poisonous juice on your shirts and sheets, which would soon make you tear your own flesh and die in the utmost torture. The general came into the same opinion, so that for a long time there was a majority against you. But his majesty resolving, if possible, to spare your life, at last brought off the chamberlain. Upon this instant, Reldresal, principal secretary for private affairs, who always approved himself your true friend, was commanded by the emperor to deliver his opinion, which he accordingly did, and therein justified the good thoughts you have of him. He allowed your crimes to be great, but that still there was room for mercy, the most commendable virtue in a prince, and for which his majesty was so justly celebrated. He said, the friendship between you and him was so well known to the world that perhaps the most honourable board might think him partial. However, in obedience to the command he had received, he would freely offer his sentiments. That if his majesty, in consideration of your services and pursuant to his own merciful disposition, would please to spare your life, and only give orders to put out your eyes, he humbly conceived that by this expedient justice might in some measure be satisfied, and all the world would applaud the lenity of the emperor, as well as the fair and generous proceedings of those who have the honour to be his counsellors. That the loss of your eyes would be no impediment to your bodily strength, by which you might still be useful to his majesty. That blindness is an addition to courage, by concealing dangers from us. That the fear you had for your eyes was the greatest difficulty in bringing over the enemy's fleet, and it would be sufficient for you to see by the eyes of the ministers, since the greatest princes do no more than that. This proposal was received with the utmost disapprobation by the whole board. Bogolum, the admiral, could not preserve his temper, but rising up in fury said he wondered how the secretary durst presume to give his opinion for preserving the life of a traitor. That the services you had performed were, by all true reasons of state, the great aggravation of your crimes. That you, who were able to extinguish the fire by discharge of urine in Her Majesty's apartment, which he mentioned with horror, might at any other time raise an inundation by the same means to just drown the whole palace. And the same strength which enabled you to bring over the enemy's fleet might serve, upon the first discontent, to just carry it back. That he had good reasons to think you were a big Indian in your heart. And, since treason begins in the heart, before it appears in overt acts, so he accused you as a traitor on that account, and therefore insisted you should be put to death. The treasurer was of the same opinion. He showed to what straits his majesty's revenue was reduced by the discharge of maintaining you, which would soon grow unsupportable. That the secretary's expedient of putting out your eyes was so far from being a remedy against this evil, that it would probably increase it, as is manifest from the common practice of blinding some kinds of fowls, after which they feed the faster, and grow sooner fat. That his sacred majesty and the council, who are your judges, were, in their own consciences, fully convinced of your guilt, which was sufficient argument to condemn you to death, without the formal proofs required by the strict letter of the law. But his imperial majesty, fully determined against capital punishment, was graciously pleased to say that since the council thought the loss of your eyes too easy a censure, some other way may be inflicted hereafter. And your friend the secretary, humbly desiring to be heard again, in answer to what the treasurer had objected concerning the great charge his majesty was at in maintaining you, said that his excellency, who had the sole disposal of the emperor's revenue, might easily provide against that evil by gradually lessening your establishment, by which, for want of sufficient food, you would grow weak and faint, and lose your appetite, and consequently decay, and consume in a few months. Neither would the stench of your carcass be then so dangerous when it could become more than half diminished, and immediately upon your death 5,000 or 6,000 of his majesty's subjects might, in 2 or 3 days, cut your flesh from your bones, take it away by cartloads, and bury it in distant parts to prevent infection, leaving the skeleton as a monument of admiration to posterity. And thus, by the great friendship of the secretary, the whole affair was compromised. It was strictly enjoined that the project of starving you by degrees should be kept a secret, but that the sentence of putting out your eyes was entered onto the books. None dissenting, except Bolglum the admiral, who, being a creature of the empress, was perpetually instigated by her majesty to insist upon your death, she having borne perpetual malice against you on account of that infamous and illegal method you took to extinguish the fire in her apartment. In 3 days, your friend the secretary will be directed to come to your house and read before you the articles of impeachment, and then to signify the great lenity and favor of his majesty and council, whereby you are only condemned to the loss of your eyes, which his majesty does not question you will gratefully and humbly submit to. And 20 of his majesty's surgeons will attend in order to see the operation well performed, by discharging very sharp-pointed arrows into the balls of your eyes as you lie on the ground. Now I leave to your prudence what measures you will take, and to avoid suspicion I must immediately return in as private a manner as I came. His lordship did so, and I remained alone, under many doubts and perplexities of mind. It was a custom introduced by this prince and his ministry, very different, as I have been assured, from the practice of former times, that after the court had decreed any cruel execution, either to gratify the monarch's resentment or the malice of a favorite, well, the emperor always made a speech to his whole council, expressing his great lenity and tenderness as qualities known and confessed by all the world. The speech was immediately published throughout the kingdom, nor did anything terrify the people so much as those encomiums on his majesty's mercy, because it was observed that the more these praises were enlarged and insisted on, the more inhuman was the punishment, and the sufferer the more innocent. Yet as to myself, I must confess, having never been designed for a courtier, either by birth or education, I was so ill a judge of things that I could not discover the lenity and favor of this sentence, but conceived it, perhaps erroneously, rather to be rigorous than gentle. I sometimes thought of standing my trial, for although I could not deny the facts alleged in the several articles, yet I hoped that they would admit of some extenuations. But having in my life perused many state trials, which ever I observed to terminate as the judges thought fit to direct, I durst not rely on so dangerous a decision in so critical a juncture, and against such powerful enemies. Once I was strongly bent upon resistance, for, while I had liberty, the whole strength of that empire could hardly subdue me, and I might easily, with stones, pelt the metropolis to pieces. But I soon rejected that project with horror, by remembering the oath that I had made to the emperor, and the favors that I had received from him, and the high title of Nardak that he had conferred on me. Neither had I so soon learned the gratitude of courtiers to persuade myself that his Majesty's present severities acquitted me of all past obligations. At last, I fixed upon a resolution, for which it is probable I may incur some censure, and not unjustly, for I confess I owe the preserving of my eyes, and consequently my liberty, to my own great rashness and want of experience. Because if I had then known the nature of princes and ministers, which I have since observed in many other courts, and their methods of treating criminals less obnoxious than myself, I should with great alacrity and readiness have submitted to so easy a punishment. But hurried on by the precipitancy of youth, and having his Imperial Majesty's license to pay my attendance upon the Emperor Blefuscu, I took this opportunity, before the 3 days were elapsed, to send a letter to my friend the secretary signifying my resolution of setting out that morning for Blefuscu, pursuant to the leave I had got, and without waiting for an answer, I went to that side of the island where our fleet lay. I seized a large man of war. I tied a cable to the prow, and lifting up the anchors, I stripped myself, put my clothes, together with my coverlet, which I carried under my arm, into the vessel, and drawing it after me, between wading and swimming, arrived at the royal port of Blefuscu, where the people had long expected me. They lent me 2 guides to direct me to the capital city, which is of the same name. I held them in my hands till I came within 200 yards of the gate, and desired them to signify my arrival to one of the secretaries, and let him know I there awaited his Majesty's command. I had an answer in about an hour, that his Majesty, attended by the royal family and great officers of the court, was coming out to receive me. I advanced 100 yards. The Emperor and his train alighted from their horses, the Empress and ladies from their coaches, and I did not perceive that they were in any fright or concern. I lay on the ground to kiss his Majesty's and the Empress's hands. I told his Majesty that I was come, according to my promise, and with the license of the Emperor, my master, to have the honor of seeing so mighty a monarch, and to offer him any service in my power consistent with my duty to my own prince, not mentioning a word of my disgrace, because I had hitherto no regular information of it, and might suppose myself wholly ignorant of any such design, and neither could I reasonably conceive that the Emperor would discover that secret, while I was out of his power, wherein, however, it soon appeared I was deceived. I shall not trouble the reader with the particular account of my reception at this court, which was suitable to the generosity of so great a prince, nor of the difficulties I was in for want of a house and bed, being forced to lie on the ground, wrapped in my coverlet. Thus ends the 7th chapter of Travels to Several Remote Nations of the World by Lemuel Gulliver and Jonathan Swift.